Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Silverstone or Great Britain GP race. What did you think of this race? Was it more than you expected, less than you expected? I thought it was a really good race, even though I'd probably give it a 5 out of 10. I thought it was an average race, even though the safety car caused a little bit of hiccups in the strategy that was going on. It wasn't enough to really push this up higher than a 5. But what was your thoughts? I thought it was, as I said, fairly good race. I enjoyed it quite a bit, even though it wasn't a fantastic race. As normal, I go back from the back of the field up to the front of the field, just talking about each driver and what my thoughts are with them. So I will start off with Esteban Ocon, who didn't have much of a race. He pulled out fairly quickly. With that hydraulic issue that he had. I think that was lap 10 that he actually ended up having to retire that Alpine. So not a good race for him and not a good chance for him to redeem himself after having some technical difficulties in the last race with going over track limits quite a bit, giving up quite a few penalties for him. So hopefully we'll see more from him in the next coming race, in that Hungarian race, to see if he can actually help himself out and redeem some of his driving capabilities. Kevin was doing fairly decent. I mean, he wasn't great, but he was doing decently in this race until his engine gave way and he had to pull over to the side of the track where it was on fire, and that caused a virtual safety car that turned into a full safety car. Not a great race for him, but he was doing decently at that point in time, I thought. Too bad that he couldn't really see what he could end up doing in the rest of this race. But that did cause some little bit of hiccups in the strategy that, helped and hurt people in this race because of that safety car. Pierre Gasly ended up doing a pretty good job in this race until he had a Stroll hit him, breaking that suspension, I believe it was, on that Alpine. So dropping him back into the DNF zone. So he actually qualified in 10th. He was running up there in that range, doing a fairly good job until, that fight with Stroll that ended up pushing him out of the race because of hitting tires and knocking that suspension out of alignment. Nick DeVries wasn't doing that great, but he didn't do much worse than his teammate Yuki in that AlphaTauri. So it seems like those AlphaTauris needs a little bit of upgrade to get pushed forward. Hopefully they will get that here in the next race or two, so they can actually fight with that back end pack, mid-range pack again. He did move up a position after qualifying 18th and moved up to 17th during this race, but not a lot from him. I know he did gain one spot at the very start of the race, so that was good, whereas Yuki gained 3 spots, but was dropped back into the field, back into that 16th position. So those AlphaTauris need a little bit of work. Hopefully they can, as I said, get those upgrades in place to give them a little bit of optimism so they can fight in that back of that pack to see if they can fight the Alfa Romeos and possibly the Haas's in that regard. Guan Yu Zhou was qualified 14th and dropped back to 15th. Not a good race for him. He did lose a spot at the very beginning of the race. I didn't see a whole lot from Guan Yu Zhou during this race, but after losing that position, he really couldn't gain it back. I think he pitted on lap 25 and just probably stuck in that back of that pack where he couldn't get a whole lot of passing done. So not a good race for Guan Yu Zhou in this race. Lance Stroll was having a horrible race. I said he started up in 12th and ended up in 14th. He was just struggling in that Aston Martin. He was at one point investigated for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, but that was actually nullified and given him back. So that was good. But then he got a black and white flag later, so that was not that great. So he had to be really careful. And then he was fighting with Gasly and getting pushed out and getting that 5-second penalty for causing a collision with Gasly. So that pushed him back into the back of that pack where he ended up in 14th. So not a great race for Lance Stroll yet again, but his teammate was farther ahead, but still didn't have the race that the Aston Martins were looking for. Hopefully they can rebound in the next race. I know they were having a couple of bad races here. I'm not sure if it's the tracks that they're in now, but hopefully they can still push forward into this championship so that it gives a little bit more fight in the Aston Martin. Nico Hülkenberg was doing fairly good, I think. Not the greatest, but fairly good for that Haas in this race. But he actually got into a conflict with Perez when Perez was working his way back through the field, and it knocked his front end plate off. And so he had to pit quite early, and that caused him quite a delay changing that front wing and pushed him back to the back of the field where he ended up working his way back up to 13th. So not a horrible job for Nico, but not the greatest job and not where he wanted to be in that Haas after qualifying 11th overall. I think Valtteri Bottas did an excellent job. He qualified 20th after his vehicle didn't have enough fuel in qualifying to do the leader test. So he was disqualified from qualifying. So he started off into the back of the field, but worked his way up to 12th. I didn't see hardly anything, if anything, in the broadcast from him. But working his way back up into that 12th position was fairly good in that Alfa Romeo, where they are not really very good competitors at this point in time. And it comes to Logan Sargent in the 11th. He qualified in 14th after we were expecting him a little bit higher after the practice sessions all weekend for that Williams, but I think he did a fairly good job, and I actually feel kind of sorry for him just being just outside of points. That's kind of a harsh area for him to be in after having such a good form during this race, but I think it should be uplifting for him to actually have a good race, getting the best he's ended up in so far in this season into that 11th position, just outside of that point range. Hopefully that'll give him the incentive to actually push a little bit farther in that Williams, and hopefully the Williams can figure out exactly why their car was so fast this weekend and apply that for up and coming venues so that they can get the most out of that Williams. Then we come to the top 10, where the Ferraris were having a horrible weekend. Even though they qualified 4th and 5th, they ended up in 9th and 10th. They did a fairly good normal job at the very beginning, even though Carlos Sainz lost a position at the start of the race. They were fighting up there, but then they could not hang on to that tire degradation and pitted quite early, I thought, in lap 19 for Leclerc, which pushed them way back in the field for him and having him to work his way back through the field. And then Carlos boxed on lap 26 and then back again on 33. So they were still struggling in that, and they missed the opportunity for that virtual safety car / full safety car to actually take advantage of that time gained for pitting. So which pushed them back in that range where they were farther back than they really wanted to be, but fighting for those end points in that top 10. So not a really great race for the Ferraris, but they did end up in both in the points, which is better than nothing, I guess, but not where they wanted to be, where they were expecting to be, probably fighting for 2nd and 3rd overall. Then we get Alex Albon, who I think did a really good job. As I said, qualified 8th and ended up 8th. I think he did a good job. He did lose two spots at the beginning of the race, but fought those back by the end of the race. That Williams, we were hoping, we were crossing our fingers and hoping that they would actually be higher in the grid on qualifying after seeing them in practice sessions. But I think he did a really good job in that Williams, keeping that 8th position overall. We've seen him a couple of times doing that start defense where he ends up qualifying fairly good and having to defend the whole race to keep all the points that he can make. So I think he did a fairly good job in that Williams. Hopefully they can actually figure out exactly what was going on this weekend and why they were fast in those practice sessions and be able to apply that in the future races. Alonso was the other one, that Aston Martin, that wasn't doing as good as we were thinking they should be doing. He qualified 9th and ended up in 7th. But that Aston Martin really didn't look that solid this weekend. And, of course, last weekend wasn't that great either. So hopefully they're not slipping down the field. Hopefully they can actually figure out what's their little mishaps were and be able to apply those and kind of take advantage. Maybe it's just these couple of different style of tracks that they were having trouble with, and they'll come back in Hungary. And I hope to see them, fighting those Mercedes and possibly the Red Bulls a little bit in the future. But so far, he just did a decent job, I think, but not great for him being that winning driver that he is. Sergio came back from 15th after having a horrible qualifying and dropping out in Q1. And so having that issue that he did, coming back to 6th wasn't horrible. I know that they were expecting him to be back on the podium, but he was struggling at the very beginning of that race, trying to get any kind of slipstreaming so that he could pass those other vehicles in front of him. So it really took him a while to get through the field. He made it up to 6th, but that's as far as he could make it this weekend. So not the points that he was really hoping that he could get after having a mishap in qualifying, but still decent points, but not quite where his teammate is. And so that's the big downfall for him, is that he's dropping pretty far behind his teammate. So there's probably no hope for him even fighting for that championship at this point in time. Then we get Oscar Piastri, George Russell. I almost skipped him. I thought George actually did a pretty good race. He started off on those soft tires, ran a considerably lengthy stint on those soft tires all the way to lap 29 before switching to the mediums, and then basically stayed on those mediums because they missed the opportunity in that safety car region to really do anything with that. So they kind of kept on that through the rest of the race. So fairly good job from him maintaining that 5th position. Then we got Oscar Piastri, which was doing an excellent job. They messed up on the pit stops slightly just because of the safety car that came out. So that pushed him back behind Lewis due to that pit stop, where he maintained. But I think they did a really good job for him being the rookie. And they sent him out on hard tires when everybody else was on softs around him. So that's that was Lewis. And George was on those mediums. So maintaining that position and not being able to get overtaken by that Mercedes near the end of the race, I think was a fairly good job for him. And he claims that he didn't even have all of the upgrades that Lando has. There's some wing bits that apparently he's getting next race, but he didn't have it in this race. So we'll see what that does for him in the Hungarian GP. So see if he can actually a little bit fight with Norris or be a little bit faster. And maybe that will give them that advantage to fight with the Mercedes again and possibly the Red Bulls. I'm not sure if this is a one-time thing for McLaren, or if they are actually made that giant leap that everybody thinks they have due to this race being a really high-speed race. So we'll see in Hungary whether the McLarens are in this time frame with those upgrades to see if they drop back a little bit in that field or not. And then Lewis did a good job qualifying 7th and ended up in 3rd. He did make the correct length of time for that safety car to come out and take advantage of that. So that pushed him ahead of Oscar. He was runner-up, I think, for the driver of the day, even though I probably would have given it to Oscar instead of Lewis. And he pushed on Lando near the end because of those soft tires when Lando was on those hard tires at the second start due to that safety car start. Really kind of put a lot of pressure on Lando, but Lando was able to hold it off. So I do agree that he probably deserves the driver of the day, as he was able to maintain that second position and even put pressure on Max through this race. I know Oscar did too. Lando passed Max at the very beginning of the race, had an awesome start where Max kind of spun those tires, giving Lando the lead of the race for a few laps before Max came back on lap 5, I think, before he took over that first position. But Lando was able to maintain that second position, and where Oscar, I was saying that Oscar on that start of the race was actually put pressure on Max, but was not able to get into that pass done for Max at the beginning of the race. So he ended up in that third position for most of the race, and then dropped back because of that qualifying, dropped back because of the pit stop that Lewis had over him because of that safety car. Lando fought really hard keeping Lewis behind him because of the hard tires versus soft tires, because of that safety car pit that Lewis got. And Lando they put hard tires for some reason on that McLaren, so he had to really defend heavily on that safety car restart. Whereas Max kind of had a freeway from that safety car, and ended up, 3.8 seconds ahead of Lando by the end of the race. So that Red Bull still has significant speed over the rest of the field. And I actually have that Max Verstappen had a 7.4 second gap at halfway marker in front of Lando as well. So even though Lando was able to gain the lead at the very beginning of the race because of a small mistake Max had, and push him back a little bit, he was able to get ahead of Lando for that first position and maintain that gap fairly easily throughout this race. Even though that happened, I'm wondering if we're starting to see a little bit of cracks in the Red Bull, or other people are making all these upgrades and Red Bull is kind of stopped at this point, maybe. I don't know if they're actually doing any kind of upgrades for the rest of this year, or if they started already concentrating on next year's car. So we'll see if they can actually see any kind of issues with that Red Bull where the other people might have a chance of actually winning races in the future, even though I don't think the championship or the Constructors' Championship is anywhere in doubt. I think that's easily done by Red Bull and Max for this. So overall, I thought it was a decent race. Not the greatest, but a decent watching race, I thought, for those that watched it. I would say go watch it if you haven't. So the driver standings. So we see Max at 255 points, so almost 100 points ahead of his teammate, Sergio. We're then same field to the top 5, and then you see George Russell passing Charles Leclerc for 6th, and then we see Lando Norris jumping up to 9th ahead of Ocon for that that podium position of 2nd spot that he got again this race. So that pushed him up, and then Oscar jumped farther up in the field into that 11th spot above Pierre and Alex Albon, where Nico Hülkenberg dropped back behind Albon because that issue that he had early on in the race, not getting into the points, where Alex had a decent number of points in this race. So overall, a little bit of change in this standard race, so that's pretty good to see. And we see some in the constructors' standings as well, even though that Red Bull is now at 411 points over Mercedes 203. So we see the McLarens jump into that 5th position, and we see the Williams jumping up into that 7th position. So that dropped back Alpine 1 position, and Haas and Alfa Romeo a couple of positions from that Williams run. So will we see anything in the future for the Williams, or will we see them falter a little bit? I can't say. Hopefully they can figure out what's going on and they can have that good fight with them. It's probably too much to ask to have them fight with the Alpines, but being in the head of that last pack would be good for them. And then we see the McLarens. Hopefully they can maintain that competitiveness and maybe even put a little bit of pressure on Ferrari, but I doubt it. They're probably stuck into that 5th position, but we'll see. Who knows? If Ferrari keeps having issues like they've had, they could falter back into that 5th position behind McLaren. And next we have Hungary, and that's going to be on July 23rd, so a couple of weeks from now. And until then, I will see you on the grid.